Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
There are around 40 lynchings that remain open cases in the state of Maryland. Two of the most famous occurred on the Eastern Shore in Princess Anne and in Salisbury. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Governor Larry Hogan signed the nation's first Truth and Reconciliation legislation. It is aimed in part at providing opportunity to heal the wounds for the families whose relatives fell victim to the crime and those whose descendants may have participated in them. In Princess Anne, it was 1931 when a young black man named George Armwood was accused of attacking an elderly white woman. 2 years later, in 1933, Matthew Williams was accused of shooting and killing his employer. Both were lynched. On the phone with us is James Yamakawa, who has focused his attention on Matthew Williams, and hopefully in a few minutes we will also have Tina Johnson, who is related to George Armwood and is also involved in the efforts by the commission. And welcome to the program.
Hi, good morning.
So tell me then a little bit, let's start with Matthew Williams and describe for me what it was like in 1931 when Matthew Williams found himself being accused of shooting and killing his employer.
Well, 1931, it was December 4th, 1931. It was just a few months after the what we call the near lynching of Yule Lee, otherwise known as Orphan Jones, out in Berlin. He had been accused of murdering, like a white farm family living in Berlin, and the authorities managed to get him off the shore, and so the tension in the area was fairly high because people felt like they had not got the quote-unquote justice that they felt they deserved. So the tensions were high, and just a few months later was when Matthew Williams was lynched.
So what was the reaction then in terms of the community, in terms of the aftermath? Because obviously you had both whites, some of whom participated or whose relatives had watched this lynching occur, and on the other hand you have African Americans who have to live side by side and in some cases are employed by these very same white folks in Salisbury.
Well, Salisbury, in Sherilyn Eiffel's book on the courthouse lawn, estimates of anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 people witnessed or participated in the lynching of Matthew Williams. That was roughly 10% of the population of Salisbury at the time. So imagine, a group of 100 people, 10 of those people then. So chances are that even if you weren't at the lynching of Matthew Williams, you knew someone who was, or you were related to someone who was. And so imagine, having firsthand knowledge that someone you knew, someone you could have been very close to, either actively took part or did nothing to stop this happening. And then imagining, again, having to, being an African-American, in Salisbury at the time, having to go to work with these people. Again, there's no way you could not have known people who would have taken part.
I also understand that at one point somebody had shouted in the crowd that Williams actually hadn't shot him, that the son was actually to blame.
Yeah, there's not, again, the official story, and again, I put that in quotes, the official story is that Matthew Williams shot his employer, Daniel J. Elliott, over a wage dispute. There is another story that's floating around, again, it's in Sherilyn Eiffel's book, and others as well, that Matthew Williams, who was noted as being a very thrifty person, he saved a lot of his money. He wanted to make sure he had enough money to save for his future. He had lent the money to Daniel Elliott's son, James Elliott. And when James Elliott refused to pay it back, Matthew Williams went to his boss, Daniel, to ask him to entreat his son to return the money. Then the son proceeded to shoot them both. Again, now we don't know if this happened. This is the unofficial story. But the thing is, no one knows what happened because no trial was ever had for Matthew Williams because they lynched him before anything could happen.
Now, the other thing that struck me, particularly we were walking around downtown Salisbury, is that there was a hotel at one point. It's now, I think, it's the One Plaza East, in which a number of African Americans were employed, and obviously many of them probably were looking on as this event occurred just almost across the street.
There, so some of the workers at the hotel were brought out to the balcony of the Waikamaga Hotel, and I mean, the hotel literally is. You could like throw a stone from the hotel and hit the courthouse lawn. It's very, very close. They were basically trapped there. They couldn't try to get home because if they did, the mob might get them too. And like I found out there was kind of an unofficial curfew put in place, and in the days following Matthew Williams, another black man who had gone out to get food, because that was found by a white mob and beaten to death. They know he was going out to get food because they found like half a ham wrapped in brown paper next to him. Like he had just gone out to get food, and a mob that apparently hadn't been satiated with the blood of Matthew Williams needed to go out and get someone else.
I want to now turn to Tina Johnson and George Armwood, who was lynched in 1933. And Tina, you're obviously related to Armwood. Tell me how you discovered that you were related and this whole story about him.
I want to say I was around about 12 years old, and a cousin of mine, he was incarcerated up in Pennsylvania, and he was incarcerated because he got into an argument with his girlfriend, who at the time was a white lady, and she didn't press charges on him. However, the state did, and then he was found guilty for a domestic dispute, and he was actually sentenced like 5 years in prison. And according to the both of them, he never laid hands on her. They were literally just arguing in public. So I remember my grandmother, like when we had told her about it, and she was just like, yes, another black man, being pretty much lynched because of the fact that he was associated with a white woman. And I had looked at her and I was just like, what are you talking about? So that's when she started to tell me. She was like, I had a cousin and he was killed. And then I was like, he was killed? And then she went on to tell me that his name was George. And she said she was around about 10 or 12. And he had came home one day and he came in the house and he started like screaming, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. And she said at the time she didn't know what was going on, but he ran in the house and he told his mother, Mom, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. And then, she tried to calm him down and they was like, what's going on? And he was like, they're trying to say I killed the old white lady and I didn't do it. And then, she said that, she thought that she had heard him say, I was just trying to help her. I didn't do it. And then all he kept saying was that he didn't do it. And then, so his mother had told him that, he needed to go talk to his white people. Because at the time, even though they weren't technically slaves, he was a slave. He was owned by another white family that lived pretty much across the field from them, not too far from where they lived, so they could technically see each other from a distance. And he actually ended up living with them because he had gotten into some more trouble a while back before all of this had happened, and he had gotten him out of trouble. So to pay him off, it was one of those things where now I own you. And my grandmother, she was telling me that later on that evening, they were all like, they seen the police and everything. They came down there and then they watched him drag him out of the woods. And then they tied him to the back of a car and then started making him kind of like walk or run or whatever you want to call it behind the car. And she was saying that was the last time she had seen her cousin. And then, she was saying like a couple days later, they had told her mom, well, her aunt, technically, they had told her aunt that, he was killed. And, she didn't believe it at the time because she didn't actually know what was going on. All of it was more like hearsay. So she wasn't actually told until after the fact when the police and the news and everything, they came there and they confirmed that he was killed. My grandmother was saying that, after they killed him, they drug him through the black neighborhoods, kind of just to let them know that, they were their superior. That was mostly what my grandmother had told me. And I want to say I was probably about 10 to 12 then when she had told me that. And then at the time I was like, my grandma, that's not true. Slavery was over a long time ago. And I guess, when you start and think about it, it wasn't that long ago.
Right.
So when I went to college, back to college, I went to Salisbury University, and I was taking a Maryland history course. And the only reason why I took the course was because my best friend, she had told me that she was going to take the course with me. And she was like, oh, it's going to be an easy A. We know everything about Maryland. Needless to say, we didn't know anything about Maryland.
Right.
So, we get in the course, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, the reading, we had to read so much. And I'm like, wow, there's tons of stuff that happened in Maryland. But then it got to this one little blurb and this entire textbooks that we were reading. And it was like talking about lynchings, but it was like one paragraph, and all it said was that the last person lynched in the state of Maryland was George Armwood. And then I remember like seeing that and just freezing. I don't know what the professor said after that. He had said a tons of stuff before and after, and I remember just being frozen on that one little blurb, and then it's saying George Armwood. And I remember he stopped for a second and he was like, anyone have any questions? And I remember like raising my hand and saying, that was my cousin. And I remember the entire room got silent. Like there was no word said. And remind you, like I said, I went to Salisbury University. There's not many black people at Salisbury University. In fact, majority of my classes, it was probably like myself and maybe two others. It just so happened that on that day, the other person that was black in my class wasn't there. So I'm going, ooh, this is a little awkward. And the professor was like, oh, maybe you should do your research paper on it. But I also remember him not wanting to talk about it also, which made me want to talk about it more. So I guess that's kind of where I'm at today.
So now he was lynched, but then they, as you said, they dragged his body, but he was also hung from a telephone pole?
Yeah, so basically the first night that he was there, a mob came and they gathered around the jailhouse and they wanted him, but they ended up sending him up to like Cecil and then into Baltimore. Of course, they argued to get him back. So once they got him back in Somerset County, a mob came once again. The judge was just like, I know you guys, like we know each other. And I guess that was kind of like the whole little warning, like I can see you, we see each other. But, so later on, of course, he went home, he had dinner, which he told everyone he was going home to have dinner. He has guests coming. And even though it was like one of those warnings, like I can see you, I know who you are. But in my mind, it was kind of more like the more I did my research on it, it was more like, no, I'm not telling you, I know who you are, as in I can convict you. It was more like, I just want to try to throw that out there that I can. However, I'm going home to have dinner, so I don't technically see you anymore. It was kind of like giving them the go-ahead. And then so basically later on that evening, they all came back. They broke into the jailhouse and they beat him and they drug him. They pulled him out of the jail cell and down the stairs. And once they got out of the stairs, they beat him some more. I believe somewhere I had read that, like they had stabbed him in the eye, and it was just basically they brutalized his body. And in other things I had read that they believed that he might have even been dead before they drug him down the stairs. That it was possible that they had beat him so badly in the jail cell that he was already dead. So once they had pulled him out, they beat him, they burned him, they hung him. They were going to hang him in the judge's yard. However, they decided to hang him like across the street, sort of, across from the judge's house. And they hung him there. And then after that, they cut him down. They drug him around the streets. And then they hung him again in front of the courthouse on a light pole, where then they set the body on fire. And of course, after they had burned them, they cut them down again, and then they threw them in front of the, what is it, Haman's? They threw them in front of Haman's in Somerset County.
So when you finally began to discover this, what was your own personal or emotional reaction to this? And especially, did it affect the way, as you kind of looked around your town again, how you related to the town?
Yeah, I would definitely say it changed my way on how I looked at things, especially because I still live in Somerset County. I still live in Princess Anne, where all these things have happened. And it just started making me remember like the little things as I was growing up that my parents would always tell me. I remember like my grandma saying one time like, "Oh, this is the lynching tree." And then and I was like, what in the world does she mean by that? And then she would always say, someone was lynched there. And instead of them tearing this tree down, they just built the sidewalk around it. And then I remember, because I remember like walking on that sidewalk so many times and thinking, why in the world is this tree in the middle of the sidewalk? And then, it was just like some of those little things that was told to me as I was growing up that I didn't pay attention to. That as now that I look around, it's just like little flashes of memory. And then every time, of course, I ride down the street, down Somerset Ave, where a majority of these things have happened. And at certain times I see, it's like, oh man, it looks so pretty down here. And then I start to remember all the blood that was on the streets. And then I've been asked like plenty of times, like, why don't you just leave Somerset? There's nothing there. And I'm like, because my family bled on these streets and I have every right to be there. And still till this day, there's definitely still some prejudice there. You can definitely feel the vibes. And every now and then, and there's certain places that I just won't go. And that's just because, like you walk into certain places and it's just like, you don't belong here. The words aren't said, but the feeling is felt, if that makes any sense.
Did you feel that as much before you learned about this as opposed to afterwards?
I would say that it was probably always there. It was probably just more along the lines of where you didn't pay attention to it before. Because there was just like times when I was younger that we would go places and then, we would be in there and then it's all of a sudden my mom's like, let's go. And I'm like, but we didn't get what we were coming for. And then it's like, it's okay, let's go. So now it's just like, I guess being more aware of it, I would say now than whereas before, where I was kind of just, I guess, blind to it. Yeah.
James, the thing that strikes me about both lynchings is that it wasn't just simply about a single act or a single violation, as it were, of law or otherwise, but that they were trying to send a message to the African American community. In case of Matthew Williams, they dragged him through the street in front of the African American community, as well as a whole ritual of cutting off his fingers and so on. This was a major social event, not just simply something that was specific to a specific act.
Well, yeah, and before I go on, I do want to echo and reiterate what Tina said about this stuff not being very long ago. Again, coming up this May 25th is the 121st anniversary of Garfield King. He was the first lynched in Salisbury back in 1898. But you just like he said that George Armwood was essentially a slave, owned by someone else. Slavery was abolished in 1865. We have a prison industrial complex where people are kept as basically as slaves in the prison system. School segregation was outlawed in 1954, Brown versus Board. Schools are now more even more segregated now. You have Civil Rights Act passed, and now there's massive voter suppression. And again, lynchings declined with the rise of capital punishment by the state. But now you have, instances of police brutality that have a lot of the thematic similarities to it. So it's like it's the past, but it's not really the past. But going back to what you're asking about, the kind of the way these things were done, they were right. They were public spectacles. They now some of this, with George Armwood, I could be wrong. It was maybe 2,000-3,000 people. Tina?
Yes, it was. I think they said it was 2,500 to 3,000 Yeah.
Again, a significant chunk of the population of the town at the time. Even if some of it came out of town, it's still a lot of the town. Like, some places in the South had like 20, 30,000 people come to these things. Like they were community events. They brought their families. They brought picnic lunches. They had postcards, like made of the lynchings and mailed out to their friends and family. They look at the barbecue we attended. I mean, like, you can imagine the kind of callousness and lack of empathy that shows. Like, so, but yeah, like these were essentially ritual murders because again, like, the similarities between George Armwood and Matthew Williams, they both were drugged through the street. They were hung multiple times in some cases. Oftentimes they were shot or stabbed. The bodies were mutilated. In the end, they were burned as some kind of sacrifice, in a sense. Like, I mean, I hate even saying that because like, it's not to condone it, saying that there's almost like a ritualistic nature behind it, and that's part of what describes lynching culture as a whole. It's a ritual murder in the name of white supremacy in order to keep black people in their place. And like I said, like, they dragged the bodies through the neighborhood. It was meant as a form of domestic terrorism, as a method of social control, saying we can do anything we want, like we as white people can do anything we want to you, and you can't do anything about it. And the lack of accountability, both then and now, kind of shows.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that there were people in the crowd that would not have done this except for the fact that they were in this crowd, this mob?
There's what's the current hashtag? Not all white people. Of course, there were people in the crowd who felt like they couldn't do anything about it, but they were still there. And there is something about a mob mentality where if enough people do something, you feel like you can't speak out against it. I'm sure not all, like Germans in the Nazi era were actively saying, I'm going to go out and commit genocide against a whole group of people. But they were still part of the system that let it happen. The people in the crowd for Matthew Williams and George Armwood and all the lynchings across the country, there were people who were more likely against it, but they felt like they felt for some reason, whatever reason they had in their heart and their mind at the time, they felt they couldn't do anything about it. They felt that because there were family members or neighbors in the crowd that were actually cheering on the lynching, that they couldn't speak out against them for fear of being ostracized in their own community. That's one of the ways that white supremacy perpetuates itself, by keeping the people who might speak out against it silent. And so that, in a lot of ways, I mean, this is not to downplay the damage and the terror and the violence put against the black community, but there is some sense damage done to the white community as well. It's not the same scale by any stretch of the imagination, but the psychological trauma of witnessing this and being forced to stay silent about it causes probably repercussions that people aren't really aware of.
Tina, well, we now have this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this process that's supposed to take place over the next 3 years. What do you hope to see out of it?
I hope to see that, more conversations, more discussions, more education in the school systems as well. Because I feel as though, like, the school systems, they educate you, but they only educate you on a certain past. They tend to leave out any type of negative things, especially when it comes to the African American community. The schools aren't necessarily teaching our children about our past. They like to leave out the past, and I'm assuming it's probably because of the fact that it is so harsh. But we need to be educated on those things. You can't necessarily move forward without being able to address the past, because we all know that history repeats itself. So if we continue to ignore it, then it's just going to happen all over again. And just like James was saying, these were spectacles, and there were mothers and children at these events. This was just like a family barbecue. These were literally just like street events. They were fairs, if you want to say, everyone was there. So we have to educate the children, and not just the African American children. We have to educate all the children so we know the effect that has happened over these years. There's so much anger, and even though these things didn't happen to us in today's age, but we still have to, I guess, reap the repercussions of all the things that have happened in the past. We have to experience the fear that our elders have passed down to us. When we're growing up, our parents are telling us all the things we can't do in public and the reason why we can't do it in public. And 9 times out of 10, it's more along the lines because, it's not white enough. I have to put quotation marks around that. Because when I was growing up, I remember everyone would always say, oh, you act white. And I'm going, how do I act a certain color or race? And basically, it's just because of the way that we carry ourselves. So if we don't carry ourselves a certain way, then we're not looked upon as everyday, like, human beings. I like to say it's definitely like a human being. We're not seen as all the other human beings. And even though the word lynching has technically been abolished, we still have lynchings today. Like James was saying, all the police brutality, those are in the same, if you look up the definition of lynching, they all fall in that exact same category. We have all of these African American men being killed on the streets, and such a brutal way. And and now with social media and everything else, these things are now being televised a lot more. So, and like with George Armwood, because it was so brutal, that's the reason why the law was passed, because it was, everyone seen it, everyone heard about it. There was, people were there, they were talking about it. It was just so horrible that it was like, oh no, we can't have this. And I feel like with all of this coming up, hopefully it's able to continue to tell everyone, no, we can't have this. Like, this has to end. We have to do our education from the past so that we can start moving forward and correcting the things that we have going on now in our present and make a better future.
I'll turn to you, James, because I'm curious about what you hope to get out of this, particularly for Salisbury. And I know just to note, for instance, that I think it was the Maryland legislature failed to pass, I think it was in 1898, an anti-lynching law. The Senate eventually, I think it was the Congress, I think eventually apologized for the lynchings. That enough? I mean, or what do we need to do here?
Well, just the fact that, both the Maryland House and the Maryland Senate, as well as the governor, all passed and signed HB 307, establishing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an official one. The first one in the nation, actually. I believe it is the first official one statewide in the nation. What that's going to do is go around the different locations in the state of Maryland that had these lynchings, and most of them have groups within them that are either in the process or have been doing the work of memorializing and educating and advocating for the memory of these victims. Here in Wicomico, that's the Wicomico Truth and Reconciliation Initiative. That is a group pouring out of members from other groups. The work has been going on for a while now. We collected members from the former Surge Delmarva group, Phoenix Youth Project, the SU NAACP. EJI came up, and we took the soil samples from the 7 lynching sites in Wicomico and Somerset, starting with Tina leading the one for George Armwood. And we've done vigils. We've taken part in the statewide Maryland Lynching Memorial Project Conference. That's a statewide nonprofit that a lot of these groups are working with as kind of like go-betweens between us and the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery, Alabama. So the work is there's a sense of urgency, I want to say, there is that history is turning here, that we're finally becoming aware of. I mean, I guess more aware of our history. Like, I guess the point is that people, in some senses, people were not taught this history, and in other senses, they were taught the sentiment behind that history, which is why people aren't supposed to go certain places. Why people like it, so it's. I guess it's a moment in time that I think is right to talk about this.
Well, we've been speaking with Tina Johnson, who is related to George Armwood, who was lynched in Princess Anne. Also, James Yamakawa has been involved with the focusing his attention on Matthew Williams and the lynching that took place in Salisbury. Probably leave us with one comment actually by Desmond Tutu out of South Africa, who is quoted as saying that if one person is dehumanized, then we are all diminished and dehumanized in our turn. Those are thoughts of Desmond Tutu in the aftermath of apartheid in South Africa. This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.